You wanted to know which planet was causing your suffering? How about Earth?
Hey everyone, Brandflex here, back with a new Eternal Return video. For today's video, we're going to be covering the mid-season patch notes, otherwise known as patch notes 1.32 for the game. Now I'm going to try and get it as fast as possible, knowing that I am a bit of a rambler and will probably stay on certain topics way longer than I need to. So if you want to skip along, I'll have the chapters down on the video below, and also I'll have the patch notes posted in either the description or the pinned comment for your ease of convenience in case you want to scroll through and skim on your own time. So first things first is going to be the new Blast Rabbit Celine skin. I'm not going to show it on screen just because I don't know if YouTube might flag my channel for it. A lot of the casino skins this season have a bit risque, but this one's a bit better than most, but I'm still not going to take the chance. If you want to see it, again, patch notes in the pinned comment or description, but it's a very cute skin. I might play it myself just because I like Celine a lot, and I think it's pretty good compared to a lot of the other ones that we've seen. The other cosmetics addition is going to be 4 new heart emotes. My personal favorite is going to be the one with the fire in the back, just because it reminds me of the "This is fine" dog, if you know that gif or that meme at all. Going through, there's also going to be a bunch of random mileage differences or like box changes that I don't really care about, but if you care, you can go through the patch notes, and also some system achievements are also being added in case you're also an achievement hunter. Now, the first real changes that the patch is going to have is going to be the ranked and pre-made changes that are going to affect all servers, Asia 1, NA, and Europe. So first of all, for all servers, Nimble Neuron is now letting 3-man pre-mades go all the way up into Diamond, which means you can 3-stack with your friends into Meteor. Now, you have to have a 3-stack, I believe, for Diamond. You can only have a 2-man up until Platinum, and if you're 3-stacking, you have to basically only play against other 3-stacks. And so they do make a note that your queue time might be really, really long in non-Korean servers, so just keep that in mind if you're doing it on EU, SA, or North America. Now, specifically to Asia 1, which is basically the Korean server, or the Japanese server, I believe, it says that Mythical players will no longer be matched with Meteorite or lower players, so that essentially means that 6800 is going to be the hard cutoff if you're playing in Asia 1. So if you get 6800, your lobby quality is going to spike exponentially just because the quality of your players are going to be hard cut off from Meteor. And also, Mythical players that are going to be hitting 7300, which is 500 MMR after the initial Mythical proc, they're also going to have a separate queue, and they still can match with the 6800 to 7299 range, but only if queue times are really long. So keep that in mind if you're playing in Korea. In the North America server, Mythical Plus players can no longer match with Diamond and below, so it's essentially just Diamond 2 and above because Nimble Neuron already made that restriction at the start of the season. And in Europe, if you're in Meteor Plus, you will no longer be matched with Platinum or lower. So your queue times might be much longer, but hopefully your game quality is higher just because the players you're getting are on average significantly better than what they were before. Now, the next big change is going to be the chat auto-translation feature. So I don't know if it actually affects all languages, but I think very specifically, oh no, it does say in the patch actually. It very specifically only affects Korean, Japanese, Chinese, and English. So basically the 3 major Asian languages and then English. If you're speaking in Spanish or Russian or German or any of the other European languages that are popular in EU, you won't get the translation. But if you are playing on the Asia server, you can now see what your Korean teammates, Chinese teammates, or Japanese teammates type to you, and they can see what you say vice versa. Now, obviously, this translation feature is still in progress, and they can only apparently translate 5 million words a day, which should hopefully not be reached very often. And you can also enable it if you want to, so you might not be able to successfully communicate with most of your teammates, but hopefully this helps out for you guys that are playing in Asia. And if you're an Asian playing in America and you're somehow watching this video and understanding everything perfectly, hopefully this translation also helps you guys play better in the American continent. So moving on for that, they are going to have a change to the VPAD improvements as well. A few other things in the middle that I skipped, but again, if you want to look at it, it'll be in the patch notes itself. So the VPAD is also going to get changed. You can now just straight up call the entire item if you have enough credits for it. So for example, the EMP drone and the traps such as C4, double guillotines, and a trap I don't really know if it's built or not, but essentially you don't have to craft those anymore, which means that you no longer make pings on the map. Now, I don't know how often it mattered that pings weren't made, but someone did mention that pings not being made for this crap spam is a bit important, but who knows if that's actually a big deal. All I know is that if you have, let's say, 100 credits, you can now just call in double Gs in Final Zone and then just plant them immediately, and maybe you can cheese people in the late game with that pretty easily, which should be an exciting change for everyone involved, just because that means that the Final Zones will no longer have the kind of click, 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 call in everything, and then craft a million times, and then you can finally place traps. Now you can just immediately call in EMP drones if you need to disable traps, or you can call in traps to immediately hinder your opponent if that scenario arises. Going past that, we do also now have the special items being available as an icon on your save plan. So you no longer have to guess if this new unfamiliar item is a meteor or a tree. So for example, one of my big problems, I think, was Commander's headset, which is a little green. So I always assumed it's a tree item, but it's actually a meteor item. So in a few games when I was building Commander headset for the first few times, I always got the wrong item because I was too stupid to check what the item was before ordering it, and I was punished. So this way, mistakes like that won't happen to me, hopefully, any longer, and I'll know exactly what I'm ordering, and hopefully that helps you guys out as well. Lumi is also going to get a few changes. Now, when you hit tab and you hold down shift, you can actually see where Lumi is going, so you no longer have to understand how Lumi pads just off your memory, which I know is very annoying and obnoxious for anyone who didn't care enough. And honestly, why should you care enough for that? And also, Lumi now leaves when temp zones are activated, which means that I believe that when you're, I think it's when it goes red. So you can still res your teammates when the zones are still yellow or about to close. But the moment the game actually closes, Lumi will no longer be there. And I think that means that you can no longer cheese out like the last few telephoto cameras or like a mocha breath at the very end. You do have to order those before zones close. We also now have an item cleaning feature where you can now have all of your items deleted after 60 seconds. This is a pretty good thing because Nimble Neuron, or rather Eternal Return, has always had a memory leak problem. So having these items go poof after a while is only a good thing because that just means that you no longer have these items like lagging your game just because those items are technically rendered off your screen while you're playing. So hopefully this improves optimization just a little bit, which was always a big deal back in the day. And going past that, we have a pretty major change happening to the game, which is going to be a Hyperloop added into Forest. Now, I'm hoping my screenshot has the actual location, but it's essentially that little ridge right before hotel and school. There's now going to be a Hyperloop, so that means that any routes that go through Forest can actually teleport out, which opens up a lot of different pathings because there were a few routes that like to start Forest, but then went to other zones that you have to walk to. So for example, Forest Chapel is now a very good route, whereas in the past, Forest Chapel into a different zone would be pretty bad because of the fact you have to walk from Forest to anywhere else. And if you want to TP into Forest as your mid zone, then walking out of there into beach or hotel or in school always felt really, really terrible. And also, this does change a lot of temp zone / final zone shenanigans, just because having a Hyperloop in your final zone means you can potentially TP out to juke your enemy or chase your enemy in a zone that has no Hyperloop. So all that said, this just means that routing will be a lot easier in the game, which is always a good thing because routing has been kind of optimized to a point where it should never be a big downside, if that makes sense. And we'll cover that a lot more when we get to the items as a spoiler. Now, they do have a brief mention about objectives spawning into the open restricted areas. So that essentially means that whenever you see those flashing red zones with a line blinking around them, that means that objectives can now spawn in there. So you want to be careful in case that you see a Omega like going into a red hotel, because in the past, like usually you just camp the zone and then be right there as it spawned, but now they might be somewhere else, which means that the other team and enemy teams might have time to either run in early if they really want to greed the objective, or you guys might meet in the middle and fight in case you guys are both waiting at opposite ends. Now, there are going to be a lot of wild animal changes. I'm calling this the bat culling, because essentially what's happening is that we're losing a ton of bats. I haven't done the counting yet when I'm recording this, but I'll have the summary here of how many bats we're losing, but it's a lot of bats, and there are essentially no additional bats being spawned in. They do say that it's just they're adjusting the population because there's too many, and I guess they just meant that there's too many bats because they are adding a lot of dogs and wolves in return. So essentially what this means is that if you're playing a melee character with no good vision check, or even a ranged character with no good vision check, you will find yourself a lot more starved of vision in the early, mid to late game, just because you'll find yourself killing way less bats. Like, I don't know how many bats are on the island right now, but they're removing a ton of them. So if you're going to take logistics, if you're going to stalk Lumi for her telephoto cameras, if you're going to save a lot of credits late game for cameras that way, then you really want to do that, because while they do say they're adjusting the bat spawns or the bat drops to have more cameras, you're just getting way less bats, which again means way less gunpowder, way less binoculars, way less cameras. You're gonna have to be really on top of looting those, most likely from beach or wherever else binoculars spawn or gunpowder spawns. So moving on from that, we will also have a wild dog change where the dogs now are like wolves, where they spawn in packs. So now dogs will spawn in packs of 3, one less of their mutant dog version, but still a pretty fearsome amount if you're a squishy character with bad wave clear or bad AoE. So now when you aggro one, just like wolves, they'll all run at you, and they're a bit squishier for that, thankfully, so you can farm mastery a bit easier. And I don't think they adjusted the mastery at all, so wild dogs are technically a lot better for mastery farming because they're way squishier while still providing the same amount of level value as they did, or mastery value as they did in this previous patch. So dogs might be a thing that you want to repeat farm just because they will be really efficient if you do have wave clear. If you don't have good AoE, like you're playing Koch or something, it might still be better to kill bears or something, but you know what I mean. Like you're playing Celine, it'll be really good for you. And now they're also adding flowers in temple, which will again add a lot of routing potential for characters that like going to temple, because you no longer have to go through like pond or stream or forest or cemetery for items that you don't really need. Like there are a few routes where you can go into temple. So like if you're going smart band or diadem, you would need the flowers to make your little flower thing and then complete it. But because flowers weren't in temple, you had to go into uptown or something to get the last flower, right? And that'd be really ugly because you just need the flower, and you could have gone somewhere with a piano wire and hammer, but now you're forced into this really bad zone because of flowers only being in a particular area. So flowers being in temple, really good for that. And also, speaking of flowers, we do have more white lilies being added. So you have a lot more jump plays. Be careful of that, just because if you're a player who plays characters who don't like to be engaged on, you now have to pay attention to a lot more angles that melees can jump you from. But hopefully it makes the game a bit more fun in the fact that you can now get away from more people and also engage on more people if you're being hyper aware of where these plants spawn. There are also going to be a few weather changes. Sandstorm is going to be a bit further. Apparently they accidentally rolled back how far the whirlwinds moved. It's either how far they move or how far you can leap with them, so we'll see once we're actually in game, just because the translations are always a little unclear. And also speaking of clear, the clear weather, which I believe removed a few bushes, they're changing that so that now you can actually hide in the bushes, just because a few brushes were just a little too far from the wall. So if you hugged that wall, you'd appear and they'd see you and they'd kill you. Now, hopefully you don't have that weird little mishap where if you're in the bush and you walk a little too far into the wall, you appear. So good changes all around. Cubes are also being buffed pretty hard. Sanguine Cube is now way stronger for melees. You're going to get a lot more base value and a lot more scaling value if you're getting Sanguine Cube on night 1. So if you're a melee character, like let's say you're playing Adela or Tia, who are technically melee characters, you're going to do not super much more damage, but a very noticeable amount. Let's just say you're level 10 when you get the cube, you're going to be doing like 15 more damage as that character. I think maybe 12 more damage as that character over 3 seconds. And if you apply it like 5 times, that's 60 more damage overall. Not a huge difference, but maybe that's the difference between you getting a very long and overdrawn kill and you not getting a kill at all. So a little bit of a fun change to Sanguine Cube. Galaxy Cube also getting an active effect. The more you run around, I believe Galaxy Cube is the skill amp one where you get 5% overcap. So now over time, I think after you deal damage, your first hit will deal a lot more damage. 50 plus 6% for melee, 30 plus 6% for range. So just a nice little burst hit when you hit somebody. And Zephyr Cube is also going to give you movement speed when you're in combat up to 6%. Which is really big because movement speed as a character who needs to auto a lot and run around a lot is a really valuable stat. So if you're going to get the cube night 1, then that means your tree or meter contest will be a lot more smooth because you might even have 6% more move speed that you shouldn't have in a fight. In fact, I think it's going to be up to a 2.1% increase because the base value is also being increased from 0.1 flat to 1.5%. So I don't know how much that maths out to actual characters, but it should overall be a very noticeable improvement while you're playing with the cube. So hopefully this makes cubes more valid to grab. And also we have mastery being changed a little bit for late game. 18 to 19 and 19 to 20 are both getting a pretty sizable bump in mastery increase, just making that level 20 mastery a bit more valuable or a bit more difficult to obtain in the late game. We're also getting a small little stat window change, which has been honestly long overdue. You can now see flat armor pen, which is really important if you're going to go for attack armor, which as you guys might know needs 30 flat armor pen to proc. I don't think it's really that big of a deal if you can do the math in your head before the build, which you often need to do anyways for attack armor. But just if you're stacking a lot of armor pen, now you know without having to add and whip out a calculator mid-game how much armor pen you had, which is always a big plus. Now, going into augments, we do have a singular augment buff, which is going to be Siphon Maelstrom. After being a tear in the preseason, Siphon Maelstrom is finally getting some love because I rarely see it. 25 down to 20 seconds for a cooldown is a pretty massive change, a lot better uptime. Going into the attack skills, we do have a lot of changes to attack skills. So first of all, Strijder is getting a flat buff. The movement speed is going to be flatlined from level 1 and level 2, and also level 2 is going to be much better for both melee and ranged after you proc it. Melee is going to see a 20 to 30% increase, and range is going to see a 10 to 20% increase. So this just gives you a bit better of a reason to level up Strijder to level 2. Might still be a bit weak, but all this means is that on level 1 you have a bit more power, and level 2 you will see noticeable increases in your movement speed. Blade of Truth is also going to get buffed. Instead of its level 2 giving you a 15% damage increase on enemies you hit, it now gives you a double hit. And this double hit will deal a lot less damage, I believe, than the first hit, but it will still be noticeably more than what you had before. So in the past, Blade of Truth wouldn't increase its own damage. You'd want to time it when you first go in so the rest of your combo does more. But now, instead of needing that like timing or like that, I guess, skill requirement, now it just does more damage by itself. So if you're playing a tank character that uses it on cooldown in like constantly, or maybe likes to use it at the end of combos, then it's a huge buff. But if you're a character like maybe Daniel and you were able to time Blade of Truth as you eat in, you might see a bit less damage from it, but still should be pretty good for the purposes of bursting people. Forcefield is also getting a change, which arguably might be a nerf. I didn't know this, but apparently Forcefield level 2 in this current / previous patch gave you the movement speed on any shield, which I didn't know about before I was told like literally today as I'm recording this video. So now instead of getting movement speed whenever you have a shield, now when you use Forcefield, you get a tenacity buff that scales with your additional HP. So if you have Forcefield and a lot of HP, you can get a lot of tenacity. Like let's just say that you have 100 additional HP, or rather, let's just say you have 500 additional HP. That's going to be 15% more tenacity. So if you have like, let's say that you have Hermes for 30%, and then you have 500 extra HP, which you probably do have from Hermes as well, you can get up to like 65% tenacity pretty easily, if not more, through augments, and that's going to make you very, very hard to control in fights. So we'll see if that adjusts tanks at all or makes it more appealing for non-tanks. But if you liked running knee pads, you're going to be technically nerfed. If you're playing Lennox, you're probably nerfed just because the shield's a big deal. But essentially, it should be better for characters that don't always have a shield online. Another attack skill being changed is going to be Quake. Quake is going to get pretty massively changed. I think it's going to be a flat buff essentially, just because a lot of your damage is going to be adjusted. But before I get ahead of myself, when you pop Quake at level 1, you now also have a burst of damage. So it'll be very Blade of Truth-like, where when you hit it, you'll do an AoE damage, which scales pretty well. And obviously, if you level it up, you'll get more damage as well as the constant tick that you had before. Now, I do think this is a massive buff to Quake level 2 and level 1, obviously, because having extra damage on tank characters is always really, really good, especially since this HP shield scales off of your additional HP. So if you're playing a tank, Quake will probably always be better than Blade of Truth at this point, especially if you're a tank rather that goes for initial pops. Because since so much of your damage has been moved to the activation, that means that if you're playing a tank that often has characters run away from you after like the first 3 seconds of your Quake, you actually do way more damage because more of your damage is front loaded, which means that you have way more value from popping Quake. This also means that you might be allowed to not rush Quake level 2 and actually get some more value out of your items if you really want to. But obviously, if you're going to go for the very late game of tank powered, Quake level 2 will always be a massive, massive power increase. So we're finally at the characters. It's a very long video. Mid-season patches are crazy. Most of the characters have been buffed. So I'll try and move all the nerfed characters down in their own section. Actually, you know what? I'll talk about the nerfed characters first. So essentially only, I think, 3 characters have been nerfed, maybe 2. First of all, Daniel has been nerfed. Daniel has been a pretty big terror in Korean and NA solo queue by building half tank, half damage, just because a lot of the tank items still do damage while Daniel is ulted, which meant that Daniel was really hard to deal with because you couldn't really kill him as he went in, and then you couldn't finish him off as he went out because he'd have a lot more health and a lot more defense than he should. And now Nimble is trying to force him into building more damage to get the damage he lost back, and hopefully that makes him more fair because now he actually has to be squishy to kill squishies. Also, the other nerfed character is going to be Haze. Haze is losing a very, very small amount of amp percent per level, and also double checking the nerfs. You also are getting a 11 nerf. 11 has been terrorizing the ladder lately in Korea specifically, so I'm surprised she's only getting a -2 defense nerf, but maybe it'll be enough to tone her down for the rest of the game. Now, going into the massive, massive list of character buffs, First of all, we have Nicky being buffed. She's going to have one less cooldown across the board on her Q, which is really important because this affects both her missed Q and her hit Q. Essentially, if you hit her Q, you're going to have to wait 0.35 seconds shorter if you have 30% CDR, and if you whiff it, you have to wait 0.7 seconds shorter if you have whiffed it, which makes it a lot more consistent, especially if you're running stuff like, for some reason, Stellar Charge. That means you can get smoother combos, and also that means your movement across the map is a lot more smooth and accessible. Tia is also going to get a buff. She's going to get a small buff to her Q, 5% more amp whenever you hit that Q, whether it's the blue slam, the yellow throw, or the red swipe. And her E is also going to lose 1 second of cooldown, which is really important because remember, Tia can't build cooldown reduction to affect her E. So that means every time she gets a cooldown reduction on her E from patches, that's a very big buff because it's essentially 10% cooldown that you would never have gotten, period. Mai is also getting a cooldown reduction buff. Her E is also going to get a -2 seconds across the board, which means that her taunt and her mobility will be up a lot more often. Ironically, I think this is a nerf that they've reverted from previous patches, so we'll see if that's enough to bring Mai back into the forefront of the meta. Markus is getting what's essentially a quality of life increase. In the past, if you had a knockback skill or a repositional skill, you could move Markus's ultimate so that it would miss your allies or potentially hit your allies if you were griefing them by accident. So now instead, Markus can no longer be moved while he's dashing. So if you're going to be playing Markus, if you want to immune a knockup or a stun, you can now use your ultimate to immune that. Let's say there's a Vanya sleep coming in, you can now immune the Vanya sleep as it comes down in case you want to use that for more skill expression. It'll be a really good buff overall. Vanya, speaking of her, is also getting a buff. Her W and her additional cooldown is going to get -2 or -1 and -2 seconds. So essentially what this means is that if you hit W and you let it expire naturally, that cooldown is now 6 seconds. And if you use W and you hit the recast, which gives you the downward slam, which also gives you an iframe, instead of being a 14-second cooldown, it's now a 12-second cooldown, which is again a massive change because it gives you more opportunities either let it tick out if you're trying to escape, or allows you a lot more uptime on your slam and your iframe. It basically punishes you less for using your iframe if you have to dodge something important in a fight. Bianca is also getting a pretty decent bump in skill amp. 4.4 to 4.6 is nothing to scoff at. That's going to be 4%, I believe, more late game, which is a pretty big amount considering how high amp percent can get and as you're going on to levels. Xiukai also getting a tiny buff to his R. It's going to give a 5% amp increase, which isn't the biggest deal because Xiukai's usually build mostly HP and very few amp items, but it might add up to like a dozen or more damage over a long fight if you hit all of your ticks. Shoichi gonna get the exact same buff as Bianca, 0.2% more to her dagger scaling, which is always going to be big. And Adela is going to get a -1 second cooldown to her W, just to give her some better uptime in case she misses her W cooldown, it lets her fish for it more often. Abigail also going to get a buff to her damage overall, plus 5% to her first Q hit, and plus 5% to her E. That's actually giving her a lot more damage if she bounces around and also hits her Q often in fights. It'll add up to a decent amount over time, but it's nothing too big. Aya also getting a -1 cooldown to her mobility, or not her mobility skill, but to her long W, which is pretty big because Aya's W is essentially her biggest damage spell for both pistol and sniper Aya. And also remember that her E reduces her W cooldown, so essentially she's going to be W a lot more, which is pretty important because I think Lenore ended up stealing Aya's place as the kind of straight line blaster of the mages. Echion, gonna get a 0.2 increase in defense per level, gonna make him a little bit bulkier in the late game. And Yuki, for dual swords alone, is gonna get a plus 5% increase to his Q damage, which might add up very significantly when you see the items that are gonna be added into the game as you get down there. Jackie is going to get a slight cooldown buff to her ultimate, -5 seconds across the board, just letting her have it more often. Camilo is getting the very tiny amp buff, or basic attack amp buff that the mages got, but instead to his auto attacks from 1.3 to 1.5 for Rapier alone. They're not buffing dual swords because I think dual swords have been very strong, but Rapier getting a tiny bit of love. Tazia gonna get a very small damage buff to her passive. You're gonna be looking at 20, 30, and then 40 more damage as you put in skill points, which isn't gonna do much for your scaling, but it's gonna be pretty noticeable if you do decide to put points into your passive early. So like when you hit people, often people have around 110 to 130 armor late game. You'll be doing maybe 15 more damage late game, which might be a difference between you killing somebody and you not getting the kill, which is super big occasionally. Priya is going to get a bit of a compensation buff from her heavy nerfs last patch. Her Q is going to do 20 more damage across the board on the initial tick, and if you hit the explosion, which is essentially queuing a flower that you've placed from your W passive or a previous Q, the explosion is also going to do 20 more damage. So you essentially get 40 more damage on a Q pop if you manage to hit it. Fiora is going to get a buff to the lockout period between her ultimate. So essentially, when you ult as Fiora, you can't spam them all at once, or else they'll be pretty broken. But they're lowering that time just to make sure that you can actually get your combo out more quickly. Hyunwoo is going to get a buff to his W. The defense is going to be increased by a pretty good amount early on. 4 to 12 early game is a massive buff, especially considering that Hyunwoo doesn't really max this early on, especially Tomboy Hyunwoo. But late game, it's only going to be a +4 defense buff, so a very needed buff to Hyunwoo's early to mid game. That's going to fall off a bit more as you get later, but still will be somewhat noticeable once you're at level 20. Hyejin, gonna get some pretty solid quality of life changes. Her Q is now gonna travel 2 meters faster, and her R will now complete the channel in 0.1 seconds earlier. So if you've ever been in a situation where you've gotten your ultimate canceled right before you could Q, or right before you could finish it, that will happen a lot less now. And also your Q just being faster makes it a lot easier to hit. If you guys like predicting people on Hyejin Q, you might need to adjust to that just because you have to lead less with it, but it should be a buff in general just because it means you can kill people faster, you can hit people faster, you can get the refund on it faster. So it's just gonna be a very nice change overall. Now, finally, we're on to weapons. So there are 3 new weapons for the patch, and they're all mithril weapons. First, we have Glove, which is going to be a new amp glove with HP instead of CDR, and Magnetic Midnight, which is an auto attack amp increase effect instead of Lich's Grasp. So this item might be pretty good on Yeon and Leon. I think there's a question if it's going to be going Nicky, but essentially it just gives Glove an additional niche where they can go a bit more tankier stats in case they want to build CDR on tank items on the other slots. For guitar, we have a new auto attack guitar called Freebird. Actually, what was the Glow one called? Iron Fist? Not a bad name. Anyways, Freebird is going to be an auto attack focused guitar. It's going to be 80 attack power, 40% attack speed, and 20% lifesteal. The lifesteal stat is a very rare stat on guitars these days, or in auto attack weapons in general, so hard getting access to this might make her a bit more tanky, especially when she has to heal up after her ultimate pops, after she went down to 1 HP because of people focusing her in there to try and kill her. Bow is also going to get another auto attack variant. It's going to be called Eagle Eye. It's going to be very similar stat wise to the guitar, 80 AP, 40% attack speed, and 0.08 movement speed. Essentially just going to give Rio a bit better or different options when it comes to kiting and spacing, just because I believe the current auto attack fire bow only gives you vigor and attack speed and attack power. So just a bit of a different option if you want to go for the more movement. Now for weapon changes, or changes to existing weapons, we do have Divine Fist getting a +4 skill amp, which is going to be the tank weapon, I believe, the one that Alonso likes building a lot. For pistol, we're going to have +2 amp to Devil's Marksman, essentially just rounding out the number, nothing too big. On crossbow, we do have Crossbow Nadine's bows all being nerfed. Sharanga, -3 AP, Blood Half Moon, -4 AP, and Blood Half Moon, which is going to be the VF Blood weapon, -4 AP. I believe these are essentially Nadine nerfs, but they didn't want to nerf Nadine specifically because Bow Nadine wasn't doing great, so they're just compensating by making Crossbow Nadine's weapons a bit weaker. Now going into armor, we do have a few new armor pieces for crit characters. So the first new crit armor piece is going to be a headpiece called Legatus. I think that's a lame name, so I'll probably call it the Dumb Hat or something at some point by accident. But essentially, Legatus is going to be your crit headpiece. So it's going to be your 4th auto attacker headpiece, but this one is going to give you attack power, crit chance, and attack speed in very high quantities. Now obviously there already is a hat that has this stat spread called GPVN whatever, the night vision goggles, but the difference between this and that is that the Myth Helm version gives you 15 attack power and 15% attack speed, and a passive that you may not use that often depending on the character you're playing, whereas Legatus just gives you raw stats, and every stat is very high quality. The other crit piece that's being introduced is going to be Dice of Destiny. If you guys have been around, you guys might recognize this dice from either Cobalt or when accessories existed, but essentially this is going to be a new arm piece. It's also going to be a 4-score item. By the way, Legatus is 4-score, I forgot to mention that. Dice of Destiny is going to be a 4-score arm piece, which is going to be 30 attack power, 32% attack speed, 35% crit chance, and 7% crit damage increase. And so this one is going to be the replacement to Radar in case you're playing a character that doesn't utilize multi-hits well, someone like Kacha versus someone like Ryu and Razi. So this will provide much needed power spike for characters that would like to have more powerful auto attacks and a good amount of attack speed, but weren't able to justify running Radar as often as the multi-hits that benefit from Radar. Now, for the other new items that are not legendary quality, we're going to have 2 new boots, and these 2 boots are probably very asked for by the community. The first one is going to be Gladiator, which is going to be the purple version of, I think they're called racing boots, whichever the boots were that gave you crit chance and attack speed in the yellow version. So essentially, this is going to be a downgraded version. It's going to be 25% critical chance and 10% attack speed. And the new purple shoes for mages is going to be one that's been super asked for. It's going to be called Delta Red, and it's going to be 13 skill amp and 10% color reduction. So it's not going to be quite up to the quality of Glacial Shoes, obviously, because it's a purple item, but it's going to be the in-between that a lot of mages wanted because Tachyons then give amp and Straight Jackets then give cooldown reduction. So having that in-between will be really nice for anyone that wants to route it. Now, for actual item changes themselves, we do have the debilitation / decomposition items being nerfed. So Blood Cloak and Astronaut Helmet are both getting a very tiny +3 skill amp buff in exchange for the passive itself losing 0.2% max HP off the base. So it's a pretty big nerf. You're going to need a good amount more skill amp to make up for it, but it's probably pretty fair considering that decomposition has been kind of ripping through people once mages get high enough skill amp. We also have another somewhat cross-Monadine focused nerf for Stall of the Wilds, which I believe is the upgraded version of Cowboy Hat. -3 AP, +2% attack speed. That 2% attack speed does not make up for the AP, so just a good nerf to bring down cross-Monadine's power a little bit more. We do also have changes to Racing Boost and Alexander. Now that there's purple items for each version, Noble Neuron is going to make it so that you have to have Tights and then the associated Meteorite or Tree of Life instead of having Bucephalus, which was the original only crit boot to upgrade it. So a bit more annoying for characters who liked having Bucephalus, but it's just to make the item path a bit more, I guess, a bit less convoluted in case a new player comes by. So yeah, that's going to be it for the That's going to be it for the patch notes. There are a few bug fixes and, changes to certain characters. But if you want to look at that, then open the patch notes on your own end, just because it's a lot more stuff that I'm not personally sure if it affects the characters a lot or not. So if you want to see if your character is included, I'll just list them off very quickly so that you can decide if you want to check or not. So Garnet, Nadine, Barbara, Celine, Arda, Jenny, Chloe, Hyejin were the characters that had bug fixes. So just let me know, or go ahead and check if you need to, in case you play one of those characters. So with that said, hope you guys enjoyed the video. Much longer than it probably needed to be, but it's been a while since I made this, and I love rambling. So if you guys enjoyed, please let me know. I'll try and make guide videos going into the future. I've decided that doing VOD rips is pretty boring, so that's why I haven't made a video until now. But I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I'll see you guys next time. Have a good day or night wherever you are. Bye-bye.